Section 22 of the Early Tudors by Charles Edward Moberly. This Librivox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 15, The Yorkist Conspiracy, Anne of Cleves, 6 Articles, The Fall of Cromwell, 1538 to 1539, Part 2. In April of this year, James V of Scotland, on his way back from France, stopped for a short time off Scarborough and boldly received a deputation of Yorkshire gentlemen asking for the help against Henry which he was well disposed to grant. After 1524, he had soon begun drifting back toward the French alliance. True, the negotiations for his marriage with Mary were more than once renewed, but neither side would take the first step, the Scottish statesman declaring that a lasting peace would be easy after the marriage, and Henry wishing for a reliable treaty before it. Till Margaret's divorce from Angus was granted in 1528, and she was allowed to marry a new favourite, Lord Methuen, she had been quite resolved to seek for help wherever she could find it, and as none came from Henry, this meant that she would appeal to France. Therefore, 2 political parties became clearly defined, that of the Lords Angus, Lennox, Murray, Glencairn, and Sir George Douglas, who were prepared to go all lengths for the English connection, being opposed to Methuen, Erin, and James and David Beton, successive archbishops of St. Andrews, who were in the French interest. From 1528 forward, the beginnings of the Reformation in England made the Scots anti-reformers, inclined to ally themselves with our enemies still more closely and to mark their religious zeal by persecution. Thus Patrick Hamilton, the proto-martyr of the Scottish Reformation, was burned in that year for denying pilgrimage, purgatory, prayer to the saints, and such trifles, says Knox. And for some time there was an exodus from Scotland of gentlemen and clerks escaping with their lives from charges of reading the Bible in English and asking Lord Dacre for relief when they were across the border. James, as time went on, was heard to boast that he was to be made Duke of York not by his uncle, but by the Emperor, and when Henry went to York to have an interview with him, the rash young man was induced by the bribes of the church party to break his engagement, thus giving up the chance of seeing how widely different from his own kingdom was that which might fall to him as Henry's son-in-law, and which his grandson was at length to inherit. As the Catholic partisans were quite determined to stop the English negotiations altogether, they also induced James to marry Magdalen, the beautiful but delicate daughter of Francis I, who died within a few months from the change of climate. It was in bringing home this bride that he received the Scarborough deputation and heard how they were robbed and murdered, and how much they longed for him to come and have all. On arriving at Leith, he bade farther defiance to England by prosecuting some of Angus's relations and supporters. His sister, Lady Glamis, a woman of great beauty and intelligence, was burned alive for treason, as Lady Bulmer had been in England. After Magdalen's death, Henry renewed his advances, but found James fatally resolved on a second French wife, Mary of Guise, the widow of the Duc de Longueville, whom he married in June 1538. Henry, meanwhile, was preparing 2 deadly blows against his recreant nephew. The first of these was an attempt to get him kidnapped while hunting on the border. A paper still remains in which the English council remarked that they find in the scheme many difficulties, above all the risk of a struggle in which James might be killed and the infamy thence arising. They admit that the proposer, Sir Robert Wharton, an English commander on the border, may have had a good meaning in proposing it, but think that he ought to be strictly charged to carry it no farther and not to communicate it to any living creature. The second scheme bore a still more threatening aspect, for Henry ordered that search should be made by Lee, the Archbishop of York, for all ancient records of homage paid by Scotland to England, manifestly intending to take up his old quarrel where Edward II had been compelled to leave it. He also allowed his Parliament, in an address to him, to call James an usurper of the kingdom which rightly belonged to his Majesty. Thus the two parties were bent on a war which might have wrecked the fortunes of both countries. Fortunately, neither possessed organizing power sufficient for a great enterprise, and though each side was well inclined to push on with reckless haste, material of war was almost entirely wanting. The Duke of Norfolk was ordered to advance with 30,000 men by Berwick to the Lothians, but provisions soon failed him, and he was obliged to disband his troops for fear of starvation. On this, James vindictively insisted on crossing the Esk and ravaging Cumberland, but the nobles told him that they had done their feudal duty in defending Scotland and had no idea of going any farther. Maddened by their refusal, he declared that they were all traitors, and not obscurely hinted that he should sweep off 100 of them by proscription. Meanwhile, he called for volunteers, who were to meet at Lochmaben, and receive their orders there, and about 10,000 men obeyed the summons. It was only when they were already in England that they found they were to be commanded not by the king in person, but by Oliver Sinclair, a most unpopular court favourite. This produced a commotion in the army, in the midst of which they were suddenly charged by a few hundreds of English border horsemen. Imagining that Norfolk was upon them, they actually turned and fled homewards, but missing the way, most of them reached the Solway when the tide was up, and were either drowned in attempting to cross it or taken prisoners on the English side. The king had remained at Caerlaverock Castle during the expedition. He now returned in the deepest dejection to Falkland, with bad news dogging him at every step, and his health daily drooping more and more. His 2 infant sons had both died shortly before, and Mary of Guise was expecting her 3rd confinement at Edinburgh. On the 7th of December, 1542, the news came of the birth of another Mary, so soon to be known by the faded name of Queen of Scots. It came with a lass, and it will go with a lass, said the hapless father, in allusion to the throne coming to the Stuarts by a daughter of Bruce, and a week later he died, leaving the government in the hands of the Earl of Arran, the head of the Hamiltons, who claimed it because of his father's marriage with James III's sister, which made him next of kin to the infant queen. The new regent at once imprisoned the leaders of the French party, and wrote to Henry a letter of appeal, asking indulgence for the baby kinswoman, who by a calamity which seemed to bring back the days of Flodden was now the hope of her country. Henry replied by offering to marry his son to the infant, and strongly endeavouring to win over the prisoners of Solway Moss to his plan, which was that Mary should at once be sent to England for education, that Edinburgh, Stirling, and Dumbarton should receive English garrisons, and that Cardinal Beaton, the great enemy of England, should be transferred to an English prison. The Scots, on their part, were willing to accept of the marriage, but only on the absurd condition that if ever the 2 crowns were on one head, an independent regency of Scotland should for the time belong of right to the Arran family. Henry's other conditions would, they declared, be resisted by every man, woman, and child in Scotland. After much uncertainty, a treaty was at last signed at Greenwich, July 1st, 1543, providing for an alliance between the countries during the life of the 2 sovereigns and 1 year more. The Queen was now to be allowed to stay with her mother till the age of 10. In case the crowns were united, the liberties of Scotland were fully guaranteed. If the infant Mary ever became a childless widow, she was to resume possession of her kingdom in peace. The settlement seemed hopeful, yet the bond was torn up almost before it was drawn by the audacity of Cardinal Beaton, who carried off Mary from Linlithgow to Stirling Castle, where she was in the power of his partisans, and on this even Arran himself, unable any longer to stem the torrent of popular longing for independence, joined the Romish party, cancelled the Greenwich Treaty, withdrew a recently granted permission to read the Bible, and announced that heretics would be prosecuted according to church law. Though the murder of Betton in 1546 at St. Andrews, to which Henry, as Mr. Burton has fully shown, was accessory before the fact, seemed likely to help toward the union with England, yet it had the opposite effect, for in the year after the cardinal's death, many of the most vigorous spirits of the English party, including John Knox, after holding St. Andrews for a time, were captured by a French army and sent as prisoners to France, leaving no one who could supply their place. It was little comfort that an English force under Lords Lisle and Hertford captured and burned Leith and Edinburgh in the following year, besides wasting Fifeshire, which seldom suffered in such wars. The burning of 243 villages and 192 towns was not the way to produce kinder feelings in Scotland, or make the people more content to accept real union. Ireland had also had its own disorders after the death of Lord Thomas Fitzgerald in 1537. Lord Leonard Grey, his captor, was ordered to put down resistance to English authority in the West. To this task he bravely addressed himself, storming various castles on the Shannon, and above all capturing Brenn's Bridge over that river near Limerick, which was so strongly fortified with marble works that artillery could make no impression on it, while the ramparts themselves could be approached only across two broken arches which had to be spanned with scaling ladders. But the tide of victory was almost immediately checked by want of money, and it was too clear that the Irish government was farther than ever from the chance of paying its own way. Stung by this disappointment, Lord Leonard was thenceforward at constant variance with his council, whom he treated most harshly and overbearingly. While on service, he disgusted his best officers by requiring the impossible, and disgracing them if they refused to attempt it. The Dublin Parliament now ventured on throwing out a bill for the dissolution of the Irish monasteries, and enmity to England daily produced the same effects as in Scotland, making the people more and more ardent partisans of Rome. At this juncture Cromwell's fall began to be expected, and Grey, who was intimate with the Duke of Norfolk, thought that he might further a reaction in Ireland such as his leader was accomplishing at home. He therefore favoured the bishops most opposed to the Reformation, and went so far as to entrust many important charges to the ever-rebellious Fitzgerald family, with whom, as we have seen, he was connected by marriage, and to maintain a bishop made by the Pope, whose appointment he was expressly ordered to disallow. All this, too, was during the perilous times when the fear of the Emperor's invading Ireland was not yet at an end. He then made a progress through the rebellious districts, and reported to Henry that his reception had been most excellent. But even he himself soon discovered that he had been deceived. His new friends were manifestly conspiring to promote the foreign invasion, and in October 1539 he had to attack and defeat the rebellious chiefs on the borders of Ulster. After this he reconciled himself with Ormond and the loyalist nobles whom he had offended, and asked for a few weeks' leave of absence from his government. This was allowed, but his locum tenens, Sir W. Brereton, soon informed Henry of new insurrections, the direct effects of Grey's wrong-headedness. The king sent the deputy to the Tower and ordered the chief members of the Irish Council to come over and give their evidence against him. It was sworn that Grey had abused those who spoke ill of Cardinal Pole, that he had taken bribes from Irish chiefs, had connived at their attacks on the more loyal, and had released from prison untried men who had been committed for treason. Above all, the incredible charge was hinted, though not expressly made, against him, that he had left behind in the West some of the king's guns with the intention that they should be found and used by the invaders. In hope of mercy, Grey pleaded guilty to his actual indictment, and was executed on the 28th of June, 1540. St. Leger, his successor in office, carried out the suppression of the monasteries, and by judicious distribution of the spoils managed to procure for the home government a certain respite from Irish troubles. The king, within a few days of his release from Anne of Cleves, married Catherine Howard, another niece of the Duke of Norfolk, a fascinating girl of 19, for whose perfections he was strongly inclined to have a special service of thanksgiving drawn up. The poor creature had, however, young as she was, dishonoured herself before marriage, and now felt obliged as queen to give appointments about her person by way of hush money to the very men who ought to have kept farthest from her. All her terrible secrets soon came out, and to Cranmer was entrusted the commission of telling Henry how he had been deceived. The only chance of life which remained to Catherine was that she should make the common pre-contract excuse, but with a truthfulness which went far to redeem her errors, she refused to make any such statement, and was attainted in Parliament for high treason and beheaded on the 12th of February 1542, with her suffered Lady Rochford, who had before done much to ruin her sister-in-law, Anne Boleyn. On the 27th of May in the preceding year, the noble old Countess of Salisbury, almost the only remaining Plantagenet, was accused for continuing, or being supposed to continue, a treasonable correspondence with her son Cardinal Pole. She loudly asserted her innocence on the scaffold, refusing to kneel at the block, and telling the executioner that he might get her head as he could, a proceeding which was considered strangely presumptuous and undutiful. Somewhat more to Henry's credit was the execution of Lord Dacre of the South, with 3 companions, for having caused the death of a gamekeeper while engaged by way of a frolic in shooting deer in a neighbour's park without leave asked. Thus sternly was the principle vindicated that homicide is murder if done in the course of an action otherwise illegal, yet true equity would have inflicted death only on the person who actually struck the fatal blow. End of section 22.